Hi, Isabel.
Hi.
Many thanks for agreeing to come on board and have a conversation with me today. You've been working closely with issues of plagiarism, authenticity in the arts especially, and you're currently a doctoral candidate or doctoral student at the Graduate Center, University of New York. And as an active participant in the conversation of plagiarism, forgery, counterfeit, and the original, how do you explore these ideas of authenticity and uniqueness of an artwork? And I would like to actually explore them together, and if we can shed a light to these seemingly different but closely associated topics. So maybe let's start with how your interest started in the issues in the first place.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have a chance to talk through these ideas that I've been grappling with myself for the past few months. But my interest in, the copy versus the original is quite long-standing, and I've thought about this in the past in relation to the printed image. So, print culture of the 19th century, for example, or thinking specifically about different print techniques that artists in the 60s were using. So I've thought about this in different ways. And in the past few months, I've started thinking about it more theoretically and trying to understand more about that tenuous relationship between the copy and its referent. So my recent project has been trying to work through an idea of counterfeit as a artistic strategy that often could be used to sort of undermine whatever body or institution that the artist is counterfeiting. So sort of thinking about this as a critical strategy.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that's quite interesting. And but before we go into depth about this, maybe we should start with some of the kind of like basic definitions and to kind of like create some kind of clarity. So how would you define what is original? How would you define what is authenticity? And if you could perhaps give us a bit of a brief introduction of how these concepts made their way into arts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I find that there's nothing basic about this question, actually. And this is sort of why it's been continuing to nag at me, because of the sort of complexity of that very definition question. But I think what's important, if I'm thinking about original and authenticity, I think what's important about both of these words is that they're both relational. So the concept of an original really only makes sense if there's the existence of or the potential of the copy, right? You wouldn't say, oh, this is the original work if there wasn't copies made of it, or if there wasn't the concern that there's, illicit forgeries made, right? And then similarly with authenticity, I think we can think of this as in part determined by the kind of threat of the counterfeit. And there are several scholars I've read who've talked about this. I'm thinking of Lionel Trilling right now, who talks about the way that authenticity, as we understand it as a concept, has provenance in the museum, which I found very interesting, because we can think of the origins of the museum as a sort of like purveyor of truth in some way, that it's very important in a museum to distinguish between what is real and what they protect and what is not real, right? The sort of trust in the authenticity of the objects it houses is fundamental to the role of a museum. So I think this, interestingly, just as counterfeits are judged based on their relationship to their authentic counterparts, how good a counterfeit it is, the authentic is similarly valued against the counterfeit. The authentic, is that what I said? The authentic is valued against the counterfeit. So I don't really think you can parse these two apart that well, because both of them are existing in relationship to the other.
Mm-hmm. That's quite interesting, these definitions, because it really makes us think about almost like let's say the counter positive, and like implies the positive in this circumstance. So how would you, and it's very interesting that you kind of like introduce the institution context into understanding these concepts, but then how would you define plagiarism or forgery or counterfeit? You've already defined a little bit, but how do we understand them if we understand the original from its fake?
Yeah. So that's specifically what I've been trying to spend the past few minutes coming up with a definition for, especially counterfeit, but then plagiarism and forgery really come into this as well. Counterfeit as a word has very interesting roots that date back to the Middle Ages. Even before that, it's sort of starting to be used. But there's this fascinating essay by Peter Parshall, who was the curator of old master prints at the National Gallery in DC. And he writes about the prevalence of this term counterfeit, or Konterfeit in German, or contrafactum in Latin, that were often inscribed on prints in the 16th century. And he found that this word comes across counterfeited by so-and-so, particularly on printed images that had to have, that wanted to demonstrate some kind of legitimacy. So certain portrayals, certain printed portrayals, this is early print culture. So there's sort of starting to try and understand what prints as a mechanical reproduction, what their relationship is to the real. So he starts to explain that the word was particularly used on printed images that had to be legitimized in some way. So the images that required an emphasis on their legitimacy or an assertion of visual testimony particularly. So this would often happen with printed images that were about some kind of miraculous occurrence, exotic animals that people wouldn't ever believe are real, or sort of strange plants from faraway lands, other sort of phenomena that required much more than hearsay in order to be believed. So what's super interesting to me about that is that from this history, counterfeit has not always held this negative connotation. It's not always been something that's bad. What it simply denotes is that it's an object that earns its legitimacy from its referent, right? It has to be directly copying it. So if you say counterfeited by in the 16th century, it would mean I've seen this myself and I'm copying exactly what I saw. So that, in fact, would denote trust, that you should trust something that is counterfeited. So that is just something I've been, trying to work through of, can we think about counterfeit in its faithfulness to its reference as something almost to be trusted in a way, as more authentic, right? If we think about counterfeit and authenticity as oppositional, perhaps they're not in a way.
Mm-hmm. But also it gets complicated as we kind of like really think about the, let's say, contemporary anthropology, where the eye and the gaze of the counterfeiter, let's say, is also important. So, and also, and if you go into neuroscience, like our perception is illusionary in some ways, in some forms. We don't perceive the same reality as everyone else because our body is different, or, let's say backgrounds, way we interpret images, and, how we compose what we're counterfeiting, So that kind of is also a very, as you said, like another basic, another clear ground that you can have a basic definition. But and I guess like it will get more complicated if we think about plagiarism in this respect.
Yeah, I mean, plagiarism, I've always sort of thought about in an academic sense, in the way that I teach my students how to not plagiarize. And I've just always defined this as, the appropriation of ideas without acknowledging where they're coming from, right? That's kind of how that's how I explain it, at least, sort of taking of someone else's ideas and passing them off as your own, which is sort of in that way, almost the opposite of forgery, which would be the, passing off your own work as someone else's to benefit from the legitimacy of their title or their or their reputation, either, forging an artist's work or forging legal documents. So it's sort of interesting that, we think about them in the same way, but they're sort of doing opposite things.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, actually. And I want to kind of like take it to the art in the current times, let's say, especially with the current shifts in the historical canon. But maybe we actually need to perhaps like talk a little bit about, there's kind of like the concept of the original before we go into today's world of digital art and NFTs. Can you give us a bit of a brief overview of how the concept of original emerges in the arts? Because it was not the case from the birth of art, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as I understand it, trying to identify, the early examples of when the cult of the original emerges, or when people start asking, particularly, I want this person's work and I don't want to copy. I understand it starting really with the early Renaissance. Prior to that, I mean, if we think, for example, about what art mainly was before that in the Western world as divine images, right? I'm thinking about, St. Luke's painting of Madonna and Child. With that painting, it was already understood to be a copy of the divine image, right? That St. Luke received when he's painting Madonna and Child. So every image that follows after that is already a copy. So at that point, just, religiously or ideologically, it didn't matter whether the work was, it didn't matter who painted it, basically, because all of it was a copy of the divine image. Then you get, during the Renaissance, things start to change a little bit. There's still not a super emphasis in early Renaissance on who exactly is painting it. If we think about the workshops, even now we're still trying to identify, was this painted by Botticelli?
Bruegel, yeah.
Or was it by one of his students or apprentices in the workshop? The fact that it's not labeled likely suggests it didn't matter back then, at least as I understand it. So anyway, during the Renaissance, though, this starts to change. And there's two developments that happen in art at that time, which is both art history emerging as a discipline with, Giorgio Vasari writing about the particular styles of individual artists and focusing really on the lives of those artists in his writing. And then we also have the birth of the art market, in which it shouldn't be lost on us that these emerge kind of at the same time, right? In which the value of a work of art is starting to be based on the skill of a particular artist, as opposed to the materials used, which had been, gold leaf, that prevalence of gold leaf very much involved in assigning value to a painting. So I've sort of been trying to think about how this idea of the original both emerged as in terms of cultural value and economic value at the same time, and sort of has come to form our dependence on it in art in a way. Obviously, this gets questioned, throughout art history, but that's sort of where I've identified the beginnings of it so far.
I think that's very interesting, because if we, for instance, especially think about the, introduction of NFTs and digital art, the definition of the original is changing again. And, it's almost like a different, like a shift. What do you think about this?
Yeah, this is where I've come at it from. So I almost went backwards from NFTs, being like, how did we get here? What's going on here? So yeah, I think, just generally the sort of global expansion of the art world has sort of, forced a reckoning with the idea of the original, in many ways. But yeah, thinking particularly about sort of tech's relationship to the original, how it's changing this. I recently went down this rabbit hole last week into AI produced works, which, have you looked at this at all? It's wild. So there are these two particular programs that I've now looked at. DALL-E is one and Midjourney is the other. And basically it's a, AI machine. You input different words, artists, concepts, and it produces for you a painting based on that. And the technology is getting really, good here. And so there's a lot of discussion about what this means for art if a machine can, generate this kind of creativity. So what you can do is you can insert, style of like Frida Kahlo style painting a spaceship or something, right? And then it creates what you would imagine she would make if she saw a spaceship and painted it. And much of it is obvious that there's not that they're not real artists. This is not the product of a real artist, of the real artist. I'm thinking particularly about one I saw recently of Trump's former advisor, Kellyanne Conway, painted by Francis Bacon. So, and it's brilliantly horrifying. And it's sort of interesting. We know that Francis Bacon obviously didn't paint this, but I wonder what's going to happen for lesser known artists when their style starts to be inputted into this generator. And there's this interesting passing apart in this from the idea. The person who's, there are AI artists now, and what they're doing is not making the works, but they're inputting the words. So the more creative your input, the more interesting the artwork comes out. So that's passing that apart from style in this very evident way. So that's one thing I've been thinking about. And then NFTs raises a whole other issue that's very fascinating and is now being grappled with legally as well. But there's this idea that the NFT in a way protects artists, right? It protects their intellectual property because it's then placed onto a blockchain. So its future is basically protected from copyright in certain ways. But what's interesting about it is that NFTs don't track pre-origin. So we're having this big issue of artists who have been NFT producers who've been minting work by artists that already existed. So artists suddenly going on to OpenSea and seeing that their work is being sold for thousands as an NFT and they have nothing to do with it. So, this is becoming an issue that all of these programs are trying to deal with. There's this crazy stat that OpenSea released earlier this year that they have a free production of NFTs, a free program that allows you to make NFTs. And apparently 80% of the NFTs minted on that free platform were plagiarized works. So they've sort of now suspended the free production and they're trying to work through basically how to deal with that. But there are a lot of different issues that are coming up in terms of plagiarism with this program that seemingly was supposed to protect artist rights.
I mean, that is kind of like quite interesting if you also think about them as kind of like image production, NFTs as image. And then of course, also like, let's say a much more traditional artwork, like a sculpture as an image or painting as an image. And then, like we have a kind of like an understanding of copyrights and like kind of like perhaps we could unpack a little bit like the relationship between the artistic idea and the image that is produced and the kind of, let's say, the intellectual property and how they're defined in the arts. Because I feel this is going to also like complicate all those definitions as well.
Yeah, what's difficult about NFTs is that, and this also often gets confused, I find, in like discussing them. We're talking about two different things here. We're talking about the image, which has its own set of potentially legal and ethical issues. And then we're talking about the NFT, which the NFT is just basically the way that it's sold, right? They're not necessarily combined. You don't have to have an NFT with the image. It's a way of selling it. So this is creating an issue between that sort of split that's being conflated is creating an issue in how NFTs are defined. And I've seen this particularly in this legal case that's now playing out, in which the argument over what the NFT is really at its core. So I'll go into that. So an artist who goes by Mason Rothschild, it's his pen name, he started making these NFTs last year, 100 meta Birkins that he released. So they are, virtual Birkin bags by Hermes that are then clearly not visually Birkin bags. He's made them furry. They're sort of very fantastical. They're covered in fur. They often are in the in like a pattern by a work of a famous artist. So you have a Van Gogh meta Birkin, you have a Maurizio Catalan Birkin, and they've been sold as NFTs. So, when he's coming out with this work, he says this is a commentary on animal cruelty in the fashion industry and the sort of production of leather. So that's why it's this sort of wild fur. But then also a commentary on the ridiculous prices that people will pay for the Birkin as a status symbol. And he really wanted to test with this image, he says, if people might take it so far as to pay that much for an image of a Birkin as opposed to the Birkin itself, right? Mm-hmm. Does that have anything to do with the fact that it's a functional object or not? So Hermes finds this and sues him for copyright infringement. Rothschild then, gets a lawyer and tries to have the case dismissed. So I called in last month into the courtroom where the lawyers were sort of presenting the case to the judge to see whether it would proceed or not. In the end, it's going to proceed. There's going to be a court case on it that will, happen in the next few years, I guess, that I think will be very interesting to follow because there's going to be a lot of, I think this will have an impact on the way that NFTs are understood legally and potentially artistically as well. But the language that both of the lawyers for Rothschild and for Hermes are using was fascinating. And the most interesting conflict was in how they are defining this work or the NFT. The artists' lawyers are insistent that this is an image, right? That ultimately we're talking about an artwork. And artworks are protected under the First Amendment in the US of free speech. So in that way, they can't, they're resistant to this, to these legal claims. And it's a critique, right? And you can't silence an artistic critique. And they bring in Andy Warhol as sort of a precursor to this, which is interesting for another reason that I can get back to in a moment. But Hermes's lawyer is insistent on that this is a commodity. It's not an image, it's a commodity. And because of that, because it's being sold as a commodity, it is infringing on copyright because it's benefiting from the name Birkin. So this, there's this sort of very fascinating question coming up here of how are we going to define NFTs? Are they a commodity? Because these NFTs now are being sold for the equivalent of a Birkin bag. Yeah. So, and that's because of the name. So it's a fascinating issue that is sort of calling into question. It could go further and call into question whether art itself is a commodity. At what point does an artwork, if it's being sold, change into that status? And will that affect the sort of ability of artists to appropriate, right? This has long been an artistic strategy that arguably Rothschild is continuing to use, but here, when it's making as much as it is, did things start to change?
Yeah, that's true. But then it's also like there are defining factors in this, like the fact that Rothschild's Meta Birkins are almost at the same rate of sales price as a bag made of tangible materials, leather, etc., is also about like the fashion and the hype, and also this kind of let's say lines of desire that has been built. But if we were to kind of come back to more straightforward cases of plagiarism, where an artist takes a work of another artist and claims that it is his or her or their own work, has of authenticity, or maybe they say it's a reproduction, or sometimes, there are these kind of methods of appropriation. Like, for instance, if you think about Louise Lawler, she always incorporates works of others into her work. But my question would be, where are the boundaries? Where do the boundaries lie? When does something become an object that is plagiarized or, let's say copied, and when it is inspired and, I don't know, like referenced. But of course you will say that referencing is important, but let's focus on the boundary. Where does the boundary lie? I think it would be really important to explore that for many people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the boundary, completely lies in intention, right? If we're thinking about Sherry Levine, Louise Lola, all the Pictures generation, their appropriating of another artist's work had a very different intent than the original work, right? Mm-hmm. And that is where this is passed apart, even legally. Mm-hmm. So, in thinking about this Andy Warhol case, for example, the Supreme Court in the US is currently hearing a case that's been brought against the Andy Warhol Foundation by this photographer, Lynn Goldsmith, who in the 80s took a photo of Prince that was then published in Newsweek, I think. And then Warhol takes her image and then makes it into his own works that are now very, very recognizable. And she's now suing him for copyright infringement. This is something that's come up before. Richard Prince has been sued for this before, and Richard Prince won. Mm-hmm. There sort of seems to be, I don't know how this is going to fall in terms of the Supreme Court ruling. What's very interesting about this case is that it was previously dismissed. Sort of the same thing that happened with Richard Prince, which is that the artist Warhol had changed the image enough that it then became his own work. So it wasn't directly plagiarizing it, right? But the former judge's argument had been, this is now recognizable as a Warhol more than it is an image of Prince. Mm-hmm. And because of that, it's Warhol's work and it's fair use. So a judge last year, though, reversed that decision, and that's why it's now going to the Supreme Court, saying that the former judge, the district judge, did not have the right as a judge to make an artistic criticism, which I just find wonderful, right? It's like, you're not an art critic, you're not an art historian, you can't judge this. Plus, it's a subjective, right? And this is the problem with all of this. It's a subjective question. But one of the important things also about this reversed decision was that the original judge's ruling on it gave celebrity plagiarist rights, right? If your work's iconic enough, if we already recognize your work, then you're allowed to plagiarize. So this will, seeing how this will play out is really interesting. But what is at the core of it legally is the Prince work, is Warhol's Prince work different in intention and meaning than Goldsmith's original work? Mm-hmm. And that's sort of, I think, is kind of where that boundary is being set. And I think I agree with that, with that boundary.
Mm-hmm. Curious also about perhaps like what you also alluded in the beginning about, let's say, the cultural value, the social value, and if we could make any connections between the concept of authenticity with the, let's say, like the domain of, let's say, cultural appropriation and as well as plagiarism.
And in thinking about this, I was reminded of Hito Steyerl's essay, The Poor Image, which discusses the way that images, as they're forced to move further and faster around the world, inevitably sort of deteriorate in quality and then become, ultimately products of these constant transfers and reformattings and translations. It's sort of hold like a record of their journey around the world in a way. And so she's sort of thinking about the way that, I don't know, I think it's an interesting way of connecting this issue of plagiarism or the copy to the actual content of this work. It's sort of an irony here of, we're talking about, how you receive information and then how you pass it on, or the sort of bastardization of an original idea or image in the game itself that is now being kind of called into question as a potential plagiarism. It's very interesting.
No, I think you're very right. I think it's very interesting about this kind of like deterioration, and it's very interesting that I was talking to an artist colleague of mine, where he also teaches in a university as well as, you know, he's a practicing artist, and he was saying that over the last 4 years he's been observing this kind of like the deterioration of image in his students' works, and in a way he's also saying that it's also about this kind of, let's say, you know, we could call it many different ways, like collective consciousness, or it's also collective consciousness informed by popularism and the popularity of Instagram imagery. But he was saying that like his students see artworks or ideas online in different platforms, but then they kind of internalize it. Perhaps it's not the poor image, but they kind of internalize it and they start thinking that it's their idea. So basically what I want to ask is about creativity and how does creativity work? Or yeah, exactly, like how can an artist produce, let's say, with the dictum of anti-plagiarism, and you know, or how do art ideas emerge?
Yeah.
Would you share, you know, would you join me in speculating about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, I think there are things that could be lost potentially in a I don't know, massive crackdown on plagiarism. Maybe that's contentious to say, but you know, sort of monitoring the spread of ideas. And I mean, it just sort of presupposes that there are such things as original ideas, which, you know, in postmodernism, we threw that out the window, but we still seem to be holding on to that in this way. But I don't know, of course, there are very serious examples of plagiarism that we're talking about here that do need to be monitored, but I do sort of, I don't know, wonder about the fear of it in a way. I'm thinking particularly about this example of Shanzai, which is something that I've gotten again into lately, which is sort of defined as, you know, it kind of started emerging in the 2000s out of Shenzhen province in China, when small factories started taking advantage of the availability of low-cost cell phone chip sets to basically create inexpensive knockoffs of well-known tech products. So cell phones were particularly a particular example about this. But since then, you know, this has sort of evolved into a Shanzai culture, which is basically, you know, evident knockoffs that often do so in sort of a playful way. So, you know, I'm thinking it would be a t-shirt that has a Louis Vuitton logo over here and the Gucci logo over here, you know, this sort of like interesting. And this sort of merging of different signifiers of luxury into these single objects. And several scholars that I've read have written about the kind of deliberate anti-elitism of Shanzai and this gesture. And this sort of irreverence for the rules of global consumerism, right? In this disregard for it. So one particular, this artist group, a duo in New York called Shanzai Lyric, have started trying to catalog examples of what they describe as Shanzai poetry. So they sort of think about this as a continuous poem and are looking particularly at written Shanzai. So sort of slight manipulations of an original message. So the one that's coming into my mind right now is Marshall McLuhan, The Medium is the Massage, things like this. And it's just sort of a play. And they describe this as a act of radical disinterest. I think that's the term they use. This sort of everyday resistance to a, you know, imperial tongue, right? And that we're gonna you know, mimic it in some way, but we don't actually care if we're getting the message across directly, or if we're paying attention to the rules of English grammar. But I bring this up here because I think, you know, since the 2000s, China has been really cracking down on the violation of copyright, and particularly these sort of Shanzai practitioners are being threatened in this. And I think, there's definitely an issue with knockoffs. If we're talking about medicine, for example, or food, you can't allow for that threat to health. But when we're talking about this sort of playful undermining of luxury brands in this way, I can't say I'm opposed to it. And I think that, in the cracking down of this, it's something will be kind of lost in the sort of everyday acts of resistance that Shanzai Lyric talk about.
I mean, like, I'm quite interested in your also like approach to this idea of originality, and like kind of like there isn't a, like, let's say, in a way, the origin of the original is yeah, it's again something, it's like a download, either the kind of like the depiction of the divine or this kind of like sovereignty. But it's I don't know, maybe perhaps I'm not really asking a question per se, but it's quite interesting with, like what you're saying about China and this kind of like copy culture being now trying to be anti-copy culture, anti-plagiarism culture. So would you say that, every culture has a premium to originality, or could you say something like that?
That's sort of, I've kind of been trying to figure that out exactly. And I've been sort of testing a theory that I'm not yet willing to say it definitively. I've been testing the theory that originality is something kind of inherently related to Western capitalism and how it emerged in the way that we're sort of selling objects. And so there needs to be an authentic in order to properly sell it. I think that I'll find things that I don't know, contest that theory. Mm-hmm. And I still need to do much more work on this to better understand it. And just sort of see, I don't know, anytime I come across a different, a culture that does not care so much about the replacement of objects, or the interchangeability of a copy and original, I'm very interested in that. But then I don't know, then I think even in just thinking about this right now, I can think of non-Western capitalist roots of the importance of originality. If we just think about the way that we spiritually invest meaning into an object, this is something that's very human, right? That the object that we have assigned a emotional or spiritual value is important in itself. So perhaps that's just, what it is to value something emotionally. Maybe that, that's some of the core of our obsession with originality as well. So I don't know, I'm testing this theory and then constantly undoing it at the same time, but it's a difficult question.
Well, I think it's quite interesting what you say, because if we also think about artworks that are charged by the artist, by the artistic intent, by the artistic labor, and this kind of, let's say, strong like relationship or that experience that gets encapsulated in the form of an object. And then, like when we live with those objects in our surrounding, then we perhaps also have that kind of, let's say, spiritual relationship. And perhaps what happens with artists taking other artists' works and like perhaps like much more directly is about, maybe the let's say the copy in a way still signifies its like where it's replicated, where it's sourced from, but it does not have the same resonance if we could transcribe that way. And perhaps that's why it gets disappointing to like, let's say you go to let's say British Museum and you see the originals, but then you also sometimes see the models of the originals because they are too precious and they need to be protected. But then that you don't have the same relationship with the surfaces that you wish you would be having. Anyway,
disappointment. There's a disappointment in that recognition when you realize you're not looking at the real thing, even though it's visually exactly the same. It's something in our minds that just rejects the lack of authenticity of those copies, and sort of trying to figure out where that came from is kind of driving a lot of this for me.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. Okay, so my last question, and thank you so much for your time. This has been really amazing conversation, is about, like I would like to bring this notion of accountability into this, like the accountability of the artist, accountability of the critic, not the judge, because the judge was not accountable, And so I'm curious how you would define accountability, or where does it reside?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very tough question. I mean, my instinct is to say, because of the emphasis on intention and purpose of appropriation or plagiarism, where the boundary of which we're still figuring out. I think it, first and foremost lies with the creator. That's sort of my gut instinct here, in that we should be citing our sources. I mean, this is what we do in academic writing, and it sort of makes sense that acknowledging sources is an important activity. And I've been thinking about potentially this whole, any obsession with, or there's a continued emphasis on originality, or, despite its apparent postmodernist rejection, we still very focused on saying, is this unique? Is this original idea? And perhaps if we acknowledge that all ideas come from somewhere, that there is influence. I mean, if we just think about the way that artistic education has always been, it's been copying, right? That's the first thing you do, is when you're learning how to be a draftsman, you copy master paintings. So this has always been, copying and having influence has always been part of production. And potentially, if we all can recognize that more, we'll be less agitated by the idea of citing influence. So, when you produce a work saying, these are the sources that I've looked at. I was very much interested in so-and-so's work, which then also is, creatively generous, in that you're drawing attention to work that you clearly admire or that inspired you in some way. So I don't know, potentially having it being more accepted that this is not, we're not talking about divine inspiration of an image anymore, right?
Yes. No, I think that is a brilliant way to actually close this conversation. But I think I totally agree with you. It's also about kind of, let's say, genuine generosity and having a frank relationship with yourself and with the others. And I think, like, something that you also mentioned in the beginning, about trust. I think, like, trust and accountability really goes hand in hand. And as you kind of like generously share what you're inspired by, then that also, plays a strong role in building trust with people that you are in conversation with, that you're in collaboration with, or that you're in exchange. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.